If they do not work, in part or in whole, why do they not work? And because there is always a bias, sometimes even unconscious, for those who are peacekeepers or issuers of sanctions or leaders of military and police interventions to applaud their own efforts, the proposals insist that empirical fact-finding and evaluations must be undertaken by independent bodies. This is the only way to be sure that the United Nations and the Security Council and wider publics know what works and what does not work. Recommendation 52 calls for empirical, verifiable circumstances that will lead to termination, for instance, of Security Council authorization for use of force. Fourth, these proposals are pragmatic. They seek to be labor efficient and realistic. Therefore, they do not ask the impossible. They make practical suggestions that make sense, that derive from Australia's own experiences within the Security Council, that rely on the insights of many experts within and surrounding the Security Council and its operations. For instance, they recommend expanding the ombudsman process in sanctioning regimes, recommendation 41. They recommend clear objectives and peacekeeping mandates, recommendation 10. They recommend continuing the successful annual conferences on policing and peacekeeping, recommendation 24. Fifth, the proposal document is constructive. It is true that the proposals are built upon a critique, that is, of command and control, or top-down approaches to changing behavior, to limiting illegal or harmful actions, which have often limited efficacy. The Security Council must lead by example. It must act through persuasion, says the report. So the proposals would enable the Security Council to exemplify the very ideals it demands of states and peoples. That is, the Security Council should be an example of rule of law deliberation and practice. It should show through its own proceedings and actions what it expects of states, of peacekeepers, and actors tempted to breach rule of law standards. This would be better achieved, says the report, by wider consultation with states potentially affected by sanctions. And it urges in recommendation 43 regular briefings by states implementing use of force mandates, also recommendation 57. And because what the UN means to most people in the world, what they see in their neighborhoods, the UN symbols, food, peacekeepers, aid workers, it is imperative that these agents of the UN, those persons charged with carrying out its mission, exemplify rule of law norms. This leads to recommendation 19 that peacekeepers be accountable for their actions, especially those that involve serious crimes against local populations. Sixth, the proposals place great emphasis on the national and local circumstances in which Security Council decisions will ultimately work or not work, be vetoed or adopted. Given the history of failure of global governance, where the wreckage of global ideals can be found scattered everywhere, this, in my view, is a wise and significant move. The proposals emphasize the imperative of understanding varieties of culture, religion, and customary practices before interventions, as well as during interventions. The proposals insist on taking seriously civil society. They say, rightly, unless the voices of powerful civil society actors are heard, and where possible, heeded, and unless civil society is enlisted as a partner in UN operations, then this, in effect, also is a formula for failure. Therefore, recommendations 27 and 28 urge continuing responsive engagements with local laws and customs and national and local actors during peacekeeping operations. The proposals recommend widening conceptions of rule of law institutions beyond formal justice systems, see recommendation 14, beyond formal justice systems to customary, informal, and other institutions that dispense justice. And those will include legislatures and especially administrative agencies, which may be far more important in the lives of the daily lives, in the daily lives of people, of individuals and groups than formal justice institutions. Seventh, these policy proposals are acutely sensitive to process. There is a strong tradition in social science research that shows that process is absolutely critical to the building of legitimacy of international organizations. While attention to process can seem time-consuming or inefficient or frustrating in global or local decision-making, it has been proven repeatedly that without due process, without giving critical audiences a voice, without degrees of transparency by decision makers, there will be widespread negative consequences. Decisions will be ignored, or rejected, or distorted. Decision-making bodies will be weakened, and their authority eroded. The proposals therefore emphasize how critical it is for the Security Council to strengthen its internal processes via transparency, consistency, accountability, and engagement, as Professor Charlesworth and Dr. Farrell have just said. The proposals repeatedly state the need for processes that provide understanding and responsiveness to local institutions. The report insists on respective dialogue with key actors in the design of rule of law programs for the Society, Recommendation 25, in pre-deployment education of peacekeepers about local laws and customs, Recommendation 29. Indeed, the proposals are built upon the powerful, empirically grounded theory of responsive regulation. Let me say a word about elected members of the Security Council, because Australia's role and leadership in this policy document points to the vital role that elected members can contribute to the Security Council. Far more attention must be given, I believe, to those great majority of the world's nations who serve for 2 years and then leave the Security Council. Elected members bring diversity. They bring the diversity of Africa and Latin America, of Pacific Island nations and South Asia, of Australasia and Central Europe. They bring the experiences of tiny states, relatively new on the global stage, alongside states with centuries of state building. They also bring the varieties of ways that arbitrary exercise of power has been used and continues to be used. They recognize the guises in which lawlessness and tyranny can be expressed, and they understand struggles with the rule of law. Elected members also bring creativity to the Security Council, because they have not been entrenched as long-standing powers inside the Security Council, because they do not reflect the inertia that so often accompanies perpetual members of any organization, because they are not locked into certain ways of thinking and acting. The elected members of the Security Council can constitute a reservoir of creative alternatives. A reservoir of creative alternatives. Australia, for instance, displayed this creativity when it joined other elected members to encourage the Security Council to take a procedural vote on the human rights situation in North Korea. Further, elected members must rely on persuasion. They have limited powers of force and usually are not states with geopolitical impact. They can be moral leaders. They can articulate and exemplify the highest ideals of the rule of law and the United Nations. They can work together with other member states of the UN to call upon the Security Council to exercise its authority in full conformity with the rule of law and in pursuit of human dignity and well-being. By taking the initiative on policy opportunities, the elected members of the Security Council can demonstrate how integral they are to the Security Council itself and to the strengthening of its legitimacy and its capacity to produce a more just world. Moreover, their service in the Security Council can have influence on its process and products before and after their 2-year term of service. Empirical evidence indicates that elected members can begin to build momentum for Security Council initiatives before they are elected or before they join the Security Council itself. Moreover, the experience they gain within the Security Council, the initiatives they lead and support, can continue well after they leave the Security Council, so their leadership has continuing and constructive impact. I therefore consider the policy proposals before you as an example of ways elected members can extend influence far beyond the meeting rooms of the Security Council for the 24 months in which they sit with other elected and permanent members. Elected members exemplify how power and influence in the United Nations can ripple well outside the Security Council, and they can embrace all of the states represented in this room today, and all of those that sit together in the United Nations General Assembly. Before I close, I have 2 rather far-reaching questions that will influence the probability that the proposals before you can become real. First, if elected Security Council members or UN states that seek to become elected members are persuaded that indeed these proposals will strengthen the rule of law and they will add to the authority of the Security Council, what are the formal and informal mechanisms that will be effective in producing these changes, particularly within the Security Council? How can this be done as a practical matter of nations working together, especially elected members? And second, some of these recommendations demand changes in behavior that could be thought of as threatening or against the national interest of states involved in peacekeeping, of sanction regimes, and the use of force. How is it possible to persuade particular states that the universal values of rule of law should prevail over their particular state interests? I conclude. It's clear to many observers of the Security Council that its increasing influence requires increased reappraisal and reconceptions of its deliberative processes and of the interventions it authorizes. Reappraisal requires creativity, it requires principled pragmatism, it requires boldness, and it requires courage. The contributors to these proposals, academics and diplomats, states and civil society organizations, not least Australia, and the elected members of the Security Council, offer such a hope. They present us, I believe, with a renewed vision, with imaginative adaptations. They offer us the determination that rule of law can restrain the exercise of global power at the global heights of the Security Council and the distant locations in the farthest corners of the world. It is in these remote places where the weak and the poor and the suffering look to the UN, to the Security Council, and to UN member states as an institution of last resort. Adoption of the proposals in this document will move the world forward. It will help silence the skeptics and bring justice and protection to those whose silent voices need most to be heard. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Halliday, for that extremely thought-provoking commentary on the report. Thank you also for acknowledging the role of elected members of the Council. It was certainly our experience on the Council that the E10, as they're collectively called, can indeed make a difference. You mentioned the North Korea inscription on the agenda for the first time, acknowledging the human rights dimension of just the non-proliferation challenges. That also very usefully built on a Commission of Inquiry report by distinguished Australian Michael Kirby, which again ties in with the report. So I think that was extremely useful acknowledgement of the role, and I know Japan is exemplary.